We'll go to what maybe was maybe the most astonishing story. Not necessarily the one that surprised me the most, but certainly the most astonishing, I think, maybe not even of the past 6 months, but of even a little bit longer than that. That's the collapse of the government in Syria and the moment that we're in now. And obviously, it's an ongoing conversation, Rania. We can't cover it all here. So I'll just preface my comments by saying I really hope people after this show also get an opportunity, in addition to listening to you here, to look at the interview you did with Elijah earlier this week for Dispatches, which I thought was, as always, packed full of information and critical insights on this issue and went really deeply on a number of different fronts. But yeah, I mean, I'll just say a few things maybe then turn it over to you. I mean, the culmination, first and foremost, of just an unbelievable campaign of an attempt to destroy a country, since 2011. I mean, I don't know what the final tally was. I think Qatar spent like $2 billion, $3 billion trying to overthrow the government in Syria. You had pretty much all the other Gulf states jumping in. You had the US, you had Israel, you had the Caesar sanctions and other sanctions, which were, some of the worst, if not the strictest sanctions on the planet Earth, trying to do everything possible to just strangle the average person on the street. In Syria, the constant bombings and attacks by Israel, the partitioning of the country that was facilitated by the United States and Turkey. I mean, maybe it's something that the full magnitude of it, even just listening to myself right now, is still kind of sinking in. I'm sure maybe there is a historical parallel, but the lengths that were gone to destroy a nation and to lead to the downfall of a government. I don't know what the parallel is. There's nothing that really comes to mind directly, and the suffering of the average person. And we hear so much, of course, about the suffering that was brought through in different ways. Some of it, of course, coming from the government in different, guises, and there's many things out there, so I don't need to talk about that. People have seen it, but the suffering that was deliberately inflicted, I think it was like 125,000 Syrians died fighting some of this opposition in the time prior to the freezing of the conflict. So, huge numbers of families and others disrupted, changed for forever in this context, and all because a handful of powerful entities decided that they did not want Assad. They wanted somebody else. And no matter who had to pay the price, they were going to do anything possible to bring him down and to create such a terrible state of affairs and chaos that ultimately he would come down. Now he has come down. We're seeing, terrible scenes, and I know you're seeing and hearing more. You're there in Lebanon, but it's just amazing for me to reflect on this project to really take down Syria. And it's really unfortunate, I think, that context has just been totally omitted from all of the commentary in the Western media. It's like there were never any sanctions, like there was never a dirty war, like there was never, I was going back and reading, Rania, and I'll stop here and hand it to you, some of the stuff from 2013 in the Western media about like the elections that were happening. And, very begrudgingly, you have Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times reporting on all these people going to vote in favor of Assad and saying, yeah, there's all these people who are so angry at the opposition and think that it would be terrible for their country if they came in, and they have criticisms of Assad, but they want to, also protect their country in ways they think are relevant. And it's like, this is their own reporting. And it's like it never happened. It was just totally memory hold. It's been totally memory hold. All these things have been totally left out. It's just this context free, people are free, people are happy, all these different pieces. And I know there's elements to that, but it just feels like historical malpractice that, there's not a deeper, more contextual discussion of how we got to this point. But anyway, that's enough of me going on and on. You're right there in the pressure cooker of the region. So, obviously, I'm sure you have many thoughts, but anything you want to offer here?
Well, yeah, I'll also preface what I want to say with I really encourage people to go watch the episode I did with Elijah Magnier like 2 days ago. It's, an excellent overview of the parts of the Syrian war that have been largely written out of the present day history that the mainstream media is giving us. And look, it's not a black and white situation when it comes to Syria. This is a country that, like a lot of countries actually across the region, unfortunately, had a very repressive dictatorship. No one ever denied that. my whole life, I've known that. My family's known that. I mean, Syria at one point occupied portions of Lebanon, and that impacted my family pretty dramatically, like it did a lot of people's families in Lebanon, who were on secret police lists. And, lots of people across the region have been in Syrian prisons. And, Baathism has had a very unfortunate way of ruling in the countries where it's taken hold as a one-party, state, whether it's Iraq or Syria. And I don't want to take that away from people, because I do know that in the downfall of this particular government, there are people who were even supportive of this government during the war, for reasons I can explain, who are kind of breathing a sigh of relief. It was a really repressive atmosphere for decades and decades that this government in Syria created. That said, I say that because the people who supported this government during the war after 2011 supported it not because they love Baathism or love Assad. They didn't fight and die against the opposition groups because they love the Syrian regime, as it's called. They did it because this is what's being written out. The US and the Gulf states in the region, and Israel, by the way, launched a proxy war on Syria where they funded a collection of sectarian religious extremist groups that were made up of ISIS, al-Qaeda, and various different named groups that were all connected to them and had a similar ideology that wreaked havoc across the country and tried to collapse the Syrian state. And lots of people in Syria, secular people, even conservative religious people, and especially minorities, saw the behavior of these groups after the Arab Spring and felt the alternative to the Syrian government that was being presented to them was so disgusting, reprehensible, and violent. They supported and fought for the government side. And it was such a threat to the entire region, not just to Syria. You had ISIS take over huge swaths of Iraq. Parts of Lebanon were invaded. There was car bombs going off in Lebanon that were directed by Mohammed al-Jolani's group, who is now, in charge of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It was destabilizing Lebanon, and you had attacks in other parts of the world by this group that was based in Syria. So this was a massive security threat, which is why you had the Iranians, the Iraqis, and the Lebanese, and then eventually the Russians get involved to save the Syrian state from falling into the hands of ISIS and al-Qaeda. That's what's being written out. And it's really important context, because now it's being described as though, like, the Iranians and Hezbollah and all these evil people just came in to prop up this man called Assad, as opposed to, no, there was like a collaboration that was carried out, a partnership to defeat ISIS. Much like what you saw in World War II, where you saw a lot of different contradictory elements come together to defeat the Nazis, including the US allying with Russia or the Soviet Union, where Stalin was in charge. You know what I mean? So these are not people who typically ally, right? They did to defeat the Nazis. So you had a similar thing take place here. And the reason that context is important is that the group that led the attack on the Syrian government, HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is a rebranded version of Mohammed al-Jolani's al-Nusra, which was the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria during the Syrian war. And I really recommend going and listening to my conversation with Elijah about that. And look, this group seems to have evolved. It seems to have pragmatically, not ideologically, pragmatically moderated a bit. And they did take over Syria. The government also didn't fight back. Assad screwed over his people. He did. And that's what people here are saying, like in Lebanon. And my friends in Syria as well, they feel abandoned by Assad after fighting and giving their lives to protect the state from collapsing. He left without saying a word, and also while lying to people throughout, saying, oh, no, we're just retreating to regroup to fight from here. So there's a lot of anger, including in the resistance axis. You see a lot of finger pointing. Iran is saying we offered help, they didn't want it. Russia saying we offered help and warned them, they didn't want it. We also told them to negotiate with Turkey. He wouldn't do it. And you also have like sort of leaks coming out of Hezbollah saying, and also the Yemenis, by the way, saying they had basically begged Assad to open the Golan front during the genocide in Gaza. He refused to. That's a whole other conversation, but there's so many elements to this. And I think it's all important context, but the fact of the matter is that at the same time, it also doesn't really matter anymore because Syria is different. The Assad government, the Assad regime is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And now you have a situation where people are celebrating, they're happy. The images, of people being freed from prisons are very heartwarming and also like very disturbing because obviously people suffered tremendously in that prison system. I hope it doesn't get replicated. And a lot of people are hoping the same thing. But you also have a situation where you have armed groups of men in a really chaotic environment in the aftermath of basically the collapsing of a state, kind of roaming and patrolling the streets. Many of them are religious extremists. Some of them are foreign fighters. There's been a few incidences here and there of violence, some sectarian violence, some kind of random violence, people kind of taking advantage of a collapse in law and order. And so people are holding their breath, kind of scared and just waiting to see what happens, especially people from minority sects and secular people. And that should not be dismissed, by the way. People are trying to dismiss that. Those fears should not be dismissed because that can turn into a very dangerous, frightening situation. That said, there's also another element of this, which is the Israelis. The Israelis took complete advantage. And right after this happened, they began bombing Syria. They've carried out almost, if not more at this point, 500 airstrikes on Syria since this regime change happened. 500 airstrikes. And what have they been doing with those airstrikes is completely dismantling and destroying Syria's entire military infrastructure. All of its air bases, all of its naval bases, all of its weapons, all of its air defense capabilities are basically gone. So now you have a new Syria, and the media is portraying it as Israel is striking Assad's weapons and Assad's bases. These are military infrastructure that belong to the country of Syria, no matter who's in charge of it, whether it's Bashar al-Assad, whether it's Mohammed al-Jalani, whether it's whatever transitional, government is being put in place right now. That is the Syrian government, and this is their sovereign military infrastructure that is being calculatedly dismantled by the Israelis with a U.S. nod, and the world is saying nothing. And people are disturbed that the new authorities in Syria haven't said anything. Now, do they have the capacity to fight back? Not really. It's just been taken away from them by the Israelis. However, it is disturbing. They have not even addressed it. They've dismissed it. And so people are very concerned about what this means for resistance in the region, because there are fears that whoever takes over in Syria is going to allow Israel to basically do what they're doing right now, which is to expand territory. Israel has basically thrown out the 1974 agreement that had a buffer zone in the Golan Heights between the illegally Israeli occupied side of the Golan Heights and the part that is still held by Syria. And that was in place until now. Now Israel's saying, we don't respect this agreement anymore. And they went over the buffer zone and are claiming to create a new buffer zone. But what they're actually doing is taking Syrian territory, which their settler groups are already planning to settle. Like, this is real. This is like Greater Israel Project happening in front of our faces. There are reports of them forcibly evicting people from their homes in certain areas and they're actually apparently like 20 kilometers away from Damascus. They're claiming they won't go to Damascus, but it's the Israelis, who knows. But also they're surrounding Lebanon from the Syrian side to cut off Lebanon further. I mean, this is an incredibly dangerous situation. They've also still not fully withdrawn from Lebanon. Every single day since the ceasefire in Lebanon a couple weeks ago, the Israelis have bombed and killed people and shot people, and their forces are still in southern Lebanon. They're supposed to withdraw over the 60-day period of this ceasefire, but who knows? It's the Israelis. Maybe they won't withdraw. And also, again, their settlers are talking about settling southern Lebanon. They are planning and deciding which plots of land. There's even been Israeli settlers who have come into Lebanon to assess the territory. with the Israeli army just kind of looking on and doing nothing about it, just like they do in the West Bank. And they've been doing that in Syria as well. This is really, really dangerous. And there doesn't seem to be anybody to stop them anymore. It's Hezbollah sort of on its own in Lebanon. It's much more weakened. It's extremely weakened compared to what it was like 2 months ago because of all the Israeli bombings. And now, I mean, Hezbollah is still able to protect southern Lebanon on the ground, but the deterrence is gone. They don't have Syria anymore because they've been pushed out of Syria by what just transpired over the last 5 days or 2 weeks. And now Syria is basically not a part of the resistance axis anymore. It's believed they probably can't be. They don't even have the capacity to be. Their defenses have been taken out. It's a really horrifying situation. It's great for Israel. It's great for America. It's bad for everybody else in the region because at the end of the day, I want to see freedom and democracy flourish across the entire Middle East, not just Syria. I'd love to see it in Egypt. I'd love to see it in Jordan. Also, incredibly repressive police states that have prisons, not so different, where people are held and tortured, just like in Syria. I want to see all those people freed too. But at the end of the day, we're talking about the Israelis really, really expanding their Greater Israel project like they never have before. The opportunity is ripe. The opportunity is there. They're taking it, and the forces of resistance are extremely weakened at this point. In Syria, it doesn't seem like anybody's going to be able to push back against it, and that's what's incredibly scary. And, before I go back to you here, Eugene, I just want to add to that in this moment, this issue has been so divisive. It's been divisive throughout the Syrian war. It split the Palestine Solidarity Movement back in 2016 and 2017 in a really significant way that it finally started to recover from, especially after the last year of genocide. And now nobody's talking about Gaza. Lebanon has been forgotten despite all the devastation in Lebanon. And we're back where we were, where people are fighting with each other. People are calling each other Assadists, which is a term that's meaningless to begin with, but it's even more meaningless than it was before now because there is no more Assad. There's no reason to run around calling people Assadists anymore. There is no more Assad. This is a moment in time where a genocidal settler state, Israel, is still the biggest existential crisis to everybody in this region. And the facts are the facts. Syria is in the hands of somebody else now. We have to deal with that and hope for the best. I really do hope for the best in that situation. But the majority of people who are watching this are Americans, and they're likely in the US. And so we have to, in this moment, try not to fall for smears, slander, and get into the whole idea of making Syria this divisive issue that tears the Palestine movement apart. Because so much work has been done over the last year to push back against Zionism. And despite the fact that Israel has materially gained a lot in the short term, at least in this region, it is more isolated than ever internationally, and there is a global movement to push back against Zionism, Israeli settler colonialism, U.S. imperialism, and we need to focus on that more than anything else. It's so crucial because what I'm seeing right now with the divisiveness is incredibly disturbing, and there is an attempt to really silence anybody who wants to question the media representation of Syria right now or how things are going to move forward in Syria. And I don't think that's a good atmosphere to have, especially when there is still a genocide ongoing in Gaza.
No, I think that's a great point, and I'll just basically leave it there with agreeing with you. I mean, I think we have to hope for the best. We have to look at this. I'll just say this, there's a lot to be said about human rights in Syria, but I think people should also read what Amnesty International, if you want to quote them on Assad, was saying about HTS in Idlib, and you might be surprised to hear some of that. And I make that point really looking at the impact of sanctions right there on you, Rania. I make that point really, not to be excessively provocative, but I think so many people have said, well, you can't put everybody in the camp of HTS in the opposition. You can't say that just because they had forced disappearances and executions and all that and torture, that everyone is like that. And of course, all the people in the opposition are not like that. But the same is also true on the other side. And I think you made the point very well, Rania, about why some people did side with the Syrian government under Assad against some of these opposition groups. And I think if there's going to be a positive future moving forward, the kind of divisiveness that takes out all the context of why people are acting in certain ways on both sides of the conflict is not going to get us there. And, I want to be as hopeful as we can. Obviously, we've seen some collaboration between elements of the former Syrian government and the new forces that are there. There's a lot of I talk about not having a de-Baathification like Iraq and having things collapse into civil war. You even see Russia and Iran continue to try to be engaged in different ways, along with the Gulf states, along with other entities. So I think hopefully there is a path forward for national reconciliation. In a way that can be really positive for Syria and for the region. But I do think that these nuances that you've introduced here are critically important to understand. And yes, Palestine, we have to keep our eyes on Gaza. And I'll just say one more time, I hope folks have an opportunity to check out what you did with Elijah Magnier. I guess that was Monday. God, this week is going so fast. But you can find it in the live tab of our YouTube page if you are going to Breakthrough News /YouTube, youtube.com/Breakthrough News. I wish it was breakthroughnews.com/YouTube. But that being said, let's just leave it there for now. This is obviously an ongoing conversation and a lot to be said and to be had here. So